Okay, so what I'm going to do today is a little different. Normally tonight is Hanukkah, so I usually would speak about Hanukkah. But, I've said a lot of things about Hanukkah over the couple of years, and what I want to say is a certain concept which, in my opinion, is one of the most important concepts of Kol HaTorah Kula, of the entire Torah. But this concept is basically not even known. Fundamentally, I don't think this is known at all. And this is the fundamental basis of every Yom Tov in Klal Yisrael. And it's fundamentally the basis of Hanukkah itself. Because without knowing this fact, you cannot be Zocher to the Nun Sharabina. And as we said, Hanukkah is about the Nun, it's about the 50th gate. Now the Torah is divided in the 50th gate, each being a higher level of wisdom. And the Jewish people at the time of Matan Torah were Zocher. We did receive up to the 49th gate. Even Moshe Rabbeinu received the 49th gate. Moshe Rabbeinu never received in his lifetime the 50th gate. And what exactly is the 50th gate? Well, the 50th gate is fundamentally shows you the relationship and the connection between every entity in the world. If you knew the 50th gate of Torah, if you knew how to read the Torah in terms of the 50th gate, and nobody in the world can do that. It has never been revealed to mankind except once. And that was with Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef, who was an actual Mashiach. He received the 50th gate and so on, and he began to reveal it in some sense to them. The closest thing that we have to the 50th gate of knowledge of the Torah is the Kabbalah. But the Kabbalah was really hidden. It was written in terms of symbols and metaphors. So even though it contains information that pertains to the 50th gate, it's basically hidden. And when Rabbi Akiva derived the 50th gate from the Torah that we have, he knew how to take it out, because the 50th gate of the Torah is contained in the Chamisha Chumshe Torah, the 5 books of Moses that we have. But nobody has ever known how to take it out. It was originally supposed to be revealed to Klal Yisrael at Matan Torah. All the Jews were supposed to receive the 50th gate, along with Moshe Rabbeinu, who was the Mashiach at that time. Because of the sin of the golden calf, the 50th gate was never revealed. Instead, the Torah was retransformed into another version of the Torah called the 5 books of Moshe Rabbeinu, the Chamisha Chumshe Torah. The Torah that we have, which is exactly Bereshis, Shmos, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Dvarim, these 5 Chumoshim are fundamentally the second version of the Torah. The original version of the Torah, which was given to Moshe Rabbeinu on Mount Sinai and forms the holiday of Shavuos, was the 50th gate. And he was bringing it down to the Jewish people. But while he was doing that, the Jewish people were at that time worshiping the golden calf. So God was so angry that he withheld the 50th gate and never revealed it. The 50th gate itself is actually the light of the Mashiach. And therefore, the only person who actually ever understood the 50th gate to a certain extent was Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef, who was exactly the Mashiach ben Yosef. It was his job to bring up the 50th gate from within the Torah itself. He knew how to do it, and he taught this information to some extent to Rav Shimon ben Yochai, who then retransferred the whole thing in a commentary on the Torah called the Zohar. We do not have the 50th gate. Now, the 50th gate is actually the light of the Mashiach. With the 50th gate, the Mashiach will be able to suddenly convince you absolutely of the existence and functioning of God, and so on. Because with the 50th gate of the Torah, you suddenly understand the connection of everybody to everybody. In other words, you know why the person is that you are married. You know all your friends. You know all your children. You know exactly why you have all these people in your life. You also know why everything happens to you, all the events of your life. So the 50th gate actually unifies every entity in the world and tells you the meaning of every entity and the meaning of every event. So it is an incredible light that has never been in the world. And it is the light that's referred to in the statement, O Chodosh al Zion Torah, a new light. God will bring down a new light on Zion. And this is the 50th gate. Why is it called a new light? It actually isn't a new light because the Torah itself, the second version of the Torah, which was given on Yom Kippur after the sin of the golden calf, is fundamentally the light of the Torah. But it completely conceals the information of the 50th gate. And at the end of time, the final Mashiach ben Yosef will reveal it to the world. And from the revelation of the 50th gate of the Torah, he will suddenly reduce and take away the whole Zom, or the evil spirit that entered the Bria because of the sin of Adam Rishon. And with that light, he will completely convert the world to the knowledge of God like the waters cover the sea. We await that time. Now, the holiday of Hanukkah is actually about the 50th gate, because what was revealed in the nace of Hanukkah, the lights of the candles burning, the candle, the oil itself for the candle, for the lights, actually existed only of one cast for one day. But instead it lasted for 8 days until the Jews were able to replenish the oil that was not contaminated. So this is the miracle of Hanukkah. The light of one day was able to last for 8 days, and this was an absolute miracle. But this symbolizes the actual light of the Mashiach. Hanukkah, maybe more than anything and so on, actually symbolizes the 50th gate, which we revealed by the light of the Mashiach. So why am I saying all of this? Because I'm not going to give a shir today on Hanukkah in terms of the 50th gate, but I'm going to give a shir today on the most important, most powerful concept that is probably revealed in the Torah, other than the absolute divinity and supremacy of God himself. And by revealing this thing, you will suddenly understand that Hanukkah, the miracle of Hanukkah, will never be repeated until the Jews suddenly understand this principle and they abide by this principle and act by the principle. So therefore, I'm going to talk about this principle now. We all know that the Zulasoi, the recipient of Olam Haba, has free will. But what does he do with his free will? What does a person do with his free will? Who does he affect? If a person chooses a mitzvah or chooses a sin, who does he actually affect with his free will? Well, what's critical is this, that free will is so powerful because it comes from the core of a human being. It comes from the core of his consciousness. The essence of a person is that he is an entity that is conscious. And what does that mean? That he knows that he exists by himself. This is an extremely powerful concept, and I've been talking about this concept for a little while now. But the key phrase that has to be understood is the concept of Vay itself. What does that mean? That a person knows himself. He knows that he exists. He's aware of his existence by himself. That means that a person has a core, a certain core in him that is fundamentally outside of all of existence. And it's the only core that makes a person into what's called a subject. And as a subject, he has this core which actually gives him knowledge of his existence. So what we said last time, that there's no such thing as the process of existence itself. Existence is known through consciousness. Consciousness presupposes the knowledge of existence. Consciousness comes from the existence of the human being. It is not attached to him, it's not merged with him to give him existence, but it actually emanates from him. So that's the origin of existence, that it emanates from the person himself, his own knowledge of himself. And the person has free will, it attends to his core. It actually comes from his core. So the free will, when we say a person does a sin or a mitzvah, what does it mean? Why does he do it? Well, we really don't understand it. What determines if a person does a mitzvah or a person does a sin? You see it. The mechanics of that is not clearly understood. We don't even know where free will resides in the person and so on. But we know that free will is so powerful that it makes a person actually create things. In other words, when you have free will, you actually create something that never existed before. In Hebrew, that's called yesh me'ayin. You create something from nothing. Even though the person was not created, he was derived from God. In a certain sense, a person is yesh me'yesh. He is a derivation from God. He was not created from God, because you cannot create a subject. You can only derive it. And God derived the Zulosoi from himself. That's why man is considered a subject in the image of God. So when a person chooses through free will, who does he affect? Well, he does not affect God, and this is very important to understand. The free will of a person does not affect God in any sense whatsoever, and so on. God's nature and God's existence is totally unaffected. When God derived the human being from himself, he himself did not change. He was not affected. So the free will of a person does not. So when a person does a sin, he doesn't affect God at all. Who does he affect? He affects himself. The target of free will is himself. In other words, when he does a mitzvah, he suddenly gives himself the possibility of kiyum, of coexistence with God forever to eternity. So he affects his own destiny, and that's it. He affects nothing else. But the destiny of man is equivalent to the destiny of all creation, because man was not created alone. Man was created in a universe with many entities. So depending what a person does through his free will, he affects the destiny of everything in the universe. Everything in the universe. So we see from this a very powerful concept. Free will is an act of creation itself, because it suddenly establishes the consciousness of man in a certain direction. If a person does a mitzvah, it concentrates the consciousness of a person so that he sees what? He does not see God as a me, a you, a duality. Normally when you're conscious, you see another person as a you and yourself as me. And God does not want that vision. God wants another person to see himself as a inner essence of a person. God is not a you. He's not outside of a person, because there's nothing outside of God. So God fundamentally is what? He's a being who's the inner me. God is the foundation of everyone's consciousness. So therefore what God says to you, and fundamentally in Olam Haba, I am you. I'm not outside of you. I'm not another being. There was no duality between us. I am your inner consciousness. I am the inner you. And that's how I want you to see me. And therefore, in order to get you to see me as the inner you, but not as a you, but as the inner person, so that you will say, I am a person, and God is my inner foundation. I have given you, therefore, a physical universe with a soul and a body that gives you two different impulses, and therefore, you have a Yetzer Hara and a Yetzer Tov. The body is the source of your Yetzer Hara, and in the Sarah, the Neshama, the soul, is the source of your Yetzer Tov. The Yetzer Hara simply says to God what? And why is the Yetzer Hara so destructive? The Yetzer Tov, the good inclination, tells you that God is not outside of you, just like you are not outside of God. And therefore, God is inside of you. God says to you, I am you. I am your foundation. And that's what the Yetzer Tov says. But the Yetzer Hara says a completely different concept. The Yetzer Hara says, no, God is a you. God is outside of you. He's another being. Now, what does that mean? Why is a sin so destructive? Because a sin is a complete falsification of God. It's a complete fallacy of what God is. And it produces two false ideas. The first false idea it produces is that God is not God. Because if God is not you, if God is an outside of you, therefore you are duality with God. There's you and then there's God. So that's why you say me and you. But if God is someone outside and he's not in you, he's not your foundation, he loses his divinity. So when you say me, you to God, you take away, in a certain sense, you rob the divinity of the Ribono Shel Olam. Because it says, Einoid Malvado, Einoid. There is nothing else but God. He has no outside. And to give him an outside, you, to say me and you, and to give him an outside, you are contaminating that divinity. You are robbing him of his power, of his divinity, because there's nothing outside of God. Not only that, that is the first fallacy you've created, that you take away the divinity of God, but actually you're giving yourself a divinity. Because when you say me, and you refer to yourself as someone outside of God, so that means in a certain way you are equivalent to God. You're not equivalent quantitatively, you are not as powerful as God, but then God becomes a Superman. He is no longer divine, there's no longer divinity. Because since you are outside of God, he truly does not have any control over you. And you have control over yourself. And this is completely false. So this completely falsified the doctrine of Einoid. Not only does it take away the divinity, the absolute inclusion of everything inside God, but it takes away his divinity because it excludes you. And by excluding yourself from God's interior, you are now God yourself, because you have a certain free will that can oppose God. But not only it can oppose God, it can actually sustain that opposition. It creates something which is against the will of God. So two things happen when you sin. Not only do you take away the divinity of God, but you give yourself a state of divinity. And that's incredibly false. And therefore, that's what causes you to be annihilated. The Yuchad pleasure that comes from the absolute unity of God annihilates you because you suddenly created a false entity of false existence. That's the consequence of a sin. But wait a minute. We really have to ask a real question. Is it true that when you do a sin, that you don't really have any effect whatsoever? Is that really true? Well, we know it's true that you don't have any effect on God. But is it true that therefore you have no effect at all, only on yourself? Is that really true? So I wish to question that, and fundamentally, I actually want to disagree with it. There's one other effect that you can have that's besides the fact that you have no effect on God. And it's not only that, it is not only an effect on you, you do affect someone else. And what is that? And this concept, this answer to this question, is perhaps the most powerful point in Kol HaTorah Kula. Who do you affect with your sin besides God? So this is what we have to, even though you do not affect God, but who do you affect besides yourself? This is what I want to talk about fundamentally. Because the holiday of Hanukkah, the 50th gate, cannot come down to the world unless you have this clear in your mind. There are two categories of mitzvahs. Those mitzvahs benodim l'chaveroi, the mitzvahs that are between man and man, like thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder, and so on and so forth. And there's another in your relationship with God, like Shabbos, Kashrus, Tefillin, and so on. These are things you do in relationship to God by declaring that He is you. But there are certain mitzvahs that you do in relation to other people. You see it. There are certain mitzvahs of the way to behave to other people. And I have a question. Why were these statements, these behavioral recommendations, were given as mitzvahs? This is a very powerful question. You know, it's when God gave the Taryag mitzvahs in the Torah, the mitzvahs that He gave in relation to Himself, I can understand our commandments. God commanded us to keep the Shabbos because the Shabbos has deep spiritual meaning, and we would not know it by itself. But why does God have to give us the commandments that to do with other people? So, like that, well, isn't it? So why did God have to make this a mitzvah, and therefore give us the consequence of what it is as a mitzvah? In other words, if God gives us a commandment, then there's a consequence where He has to punish us thereafter, right after that. But how else do we say God should have given us? Well, He could have given us all the commandments that relate to other people, not as a commandment that we have to do it, and if we don't do it, we are punished. So there's a negative consequence when God gives a mitzvah. God could have given us that as a suggestion. That's right. God could have simply have told us, you cannot what? You cannot steal from another person. Why? Well, it's obvious. If you allow stealing to take place, one person steals from another, then the human race cannot exist. You cannot have a kiyum. It cannot continue to exist. People steal from each other continuously, and all mankind steals from each other. There is no such thing as bias, as ownership. No one can truly say that he owns anything because the object that he owns would be stolen. And if the normal behavior, the normative behavior of mankind was to steal, you cannot have the kiyum of financial matters or economic. So therefore, God has to give a suggestion. My advice to you, mankind, is that if you steal from each other and you permit this, in other words, you legalize stealing in certain ways, then you will destroy mankind. Why? Because civilization cannot maintain itself if stealing is completely legal. The same thing with murder. If people who are angry at another person suddenly decide to murder that other person, and there's no legal repercussions, in other words, so God would say to you, you cannot do this. Because once people find it legal to steal and find it permissible, mankind could never survive. Because everyone in this life at one time or another is angry at another person. Even sometimes we have such a feeling of rage and anger, we could kill that other person. So if this were allowed, if people were allowed to kill each other when they get angry or very angry, mankind has no guarantee that it can survive. So therefore, God would have to at least suggest, to us and tell us as an Eitzah Tova, as a good suggestion of what mankind requires in his behavior to protect the continuity of civilization. So therefore, my question is, why did God have to give these as commandments? I can understand why the mitzvah between Him and us is a commandment. But I cannot understand why the behavior that we should exercise is a commandment. It should have been given as a suggestion and so on. Because a commandment is very different than a suggestion. And in terms of a suggestion, if you transgress the suggestion and you jeopardize the continuity of mankind, that's very dangerous. But if you do the behavior not as a suggestion, but it's a commandment, not only do you jeopardize the continuity of civilization, but you jeopardize yourself. Why? Because God will give you a consequence. He will severely punish you. Besides the effect that you have on mankind, He will severely punish you. That's called a sin, and that could result in your annihilation. So the question is, why did give God all the mitzvahs between man and man as a commandment that you have to do? You have no choice. God is not simply suggesting it. So what's the reason for that? And what's the meaning of that? Well, in order to answer this question really reveals a shocking concept. And in order to explain this concept, I have to give a certain analogy of people who need to build a certain structure. It's called a construction crew. Whenever you have to build a certain structure, like a building or anything, a field, anything, you have to hire a construction crew. And who composes this construction crew? Well, fundamentally, are these crew people, are these workers, are they homogeneous or heterogeneous? Well, it depends if the job that you require is simple or complex. If you have a very simple job, like you want people to create a baseball field in some way, so all the people who construct a baseball field dig the earth and flatten the earth so that it's a flat plane. So all the people that you have in your construction crew are simply people who do the same job. They can all dig up the ground and flatten it, and then suddenly you have a baseball field. But that's a simple job, to construct a field. But what happens if you have to construct a building? Now wait a minute, the building is a much more complex item. Why? Because the building has at least 4 or 5 components to it. First of all, you need carpenters. Carpenters have to build first of all, you need metal workers, people who construct beams and attach beams to each other. So you have to construct people who can handle steel and iron and beams. And then you have that, and that's a separate skill. And then after that, you have to hire carpenters. Carpenters are a specific skill. They put up wood, they construct wood, they make all kinds of things out of wood. So to build the walls and the floors and so on and so forth of the building, you need to hire carpenters. But once you hire carpenters, then you also want to put in what? Wiring. You wanted to put electricity in the building. You want access to what? To lights. You want access to air conditioning. You want access to electricity so that you can do things and by doing things with certain instruments, you have electricity. So therefore, you have to hire electricians to do the electrical work, and carpenters to do the woodwork, and beam metallurgists who do the work on the beams. Also, you have to hire plumbers. Why? Because you want to build in that system bathrooms. You want the availability of water. So therefore, you have to have plumbers. And then finally, when you finish the building, the structure of the building, and you have a full beam with all wiring and plumbing and so on and so forth, you also now have to put the bricks on the building. So you have to hire a crew of brick workers. Each one of these categories is fundamentally a different skill. So this is a construction job that requires a construction crew, each one having completely different skills. So therefore, the construction crew that it takes to build a building is much more complex than a construction crew that has to build a field. The construction crew that has to build a building is said to be heterogeneous. They are different skills for different categories of people, and they're completely different for each other. Plumbers have a different skill than electricians, who have a different skill than carpenters, and so on. But if you have a simple job, you can take a crew people where everyone does the same job. That's called a homogeneous crew. Everyone has the same job. So in other words, what is the relationship between all these people? Well, because especially in a heterogeneous crew where you're building a complex structure, these people have to respect each other. They have to be able to work with each other. They have to have peace and tranquility between them. And by respecting each other's opinion, by respecting each other's professional skill, they enable the building to be formed. So therefore, we see this important fact. Any type of a construction job needs many times different categories of workers. These categories of workers, in order to work together, and they have to respect each other's professional skill to do so, and they know they have to do that Because if the plumbers fight with the electricians or fight with what? With the carpenters, they can never get anything done. So therefore we see from this that in any constructing job there has to be respect and a certain tranquility among the crew members. And this is what I mean, because all Jews together have to be involved in the construction of Olam Haba. What do we do when we accomplish mitzvahs? What are we actually creating? We are creating a state of eternity called Olam Haba, which is beyond space, beyond time, and beyond action. But in order to create this type of eternity, which is beyond time, in order to create such a thing, we have to be able to respect each other and live together as peaceful people. So therefore, that's why the mitzvahs are there, but they should not have been mitzvahs. They should not have been mitzvahs. They should have been suggestions. They should have been behavioral suggestions that God would give mankind so that the people can get together. Jews and in their entirety, what? Build Olam Haba. That's the construction job. That's the consequence of doing mitzvahs. When you do mitzvahs, Jews together, in terms of the Jewish people, they are involved in the construction of Olam Haba and so on. Olam Haba is actually not a building. Olam Haba is really a condition or a situation. But nevertheless, their mitzvahs are involved in the construction of Olam Haba, and as such, they have to get together. So the question still remains. So why does God have to give them mitzvahs? Between man and man, why does he have to give them commandments instead of simply behavioral recommendations? Not only that, there's another tremendous question that we have to ask. Now, I've never seen this question asked. I've never seen anyone really ask this, but this is really an extremely powerful question. Why did God create people? Why did God create a certain number of people? In other words, when you look at the human race has about 7 billion people. Who made them? Well, God made them. Why did God have to make 7 billion people? It doesn't make a difference. Even Klal Yisrael, even the Jewish people, let's say, would have been composed of hundreds of millions of people had they not been destroyed in many pogroms. But whatever it is, the Jewish people has a certain number. God had to create, or did create, all the Jews. Now, why? Why do we need Jews? Why do we need people in general? What is the concept of a person? I'm asking an extremely fundamental question. What is a person that God suddenly decided to create a certain number of people? There's an absolute fact. From the time of Adam Rishon until the time that the Mashiach comes, there will be a certain number of people that will have been made. That's right. Mankind has a fixed quantity. He has a fixed amount. But the question is, why? In other words, when God created Adam Rishon, all the people, all the time together, actually composed Adam Rishon. We were once part of Adam Rishon before the sin. That's right. Every person that existed after Adam Rishon was once a specific cell in his body as a person. So what does this mean? What does this mean that we were a cell in his body? Well, in a body, there's a concept of an organism, and every cell in the body has a certain function, right? But it also has collective functions with groups of people. So apparently God needed all these people to do a certain specific job in order to create Olam Haba and the mitzvahs. But God intended originally only to create one man. That's right. God had no intention of from that one man to take all of mankind. Because if Adam Rishon had not done the sin, if he had done the mitzvah of not eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, God would never have differentiated. Adam Rishon would never become what? Be differentiated and disintegrated into many people. Now there's a certain statement of Chazal that says, Ein ben David ba, the Mashiach ben David does not come, and he is the final Mashiach after Mashiach ben Yosef. And it says, Ein ben David ba, the Mashiach ben David does not come, Ella ad sheyichala kol haneshama shebaguf. In other words, it says, when all the souls that reside in a certain storage bin called the guf, The guf is the name of the storage facility that holds all the neshamas that would ever come down to the planet Earth in a certain place called the guf. It's called the guf, the body. And why it's called the guf is another question, but we're not going to answer that. But it's called the guf. It's a body. So all the souls that God would ever make from the beginning of time, from Adam Rishon, to the end of time, to the time of Mashiach, is a certain number of souls that exist in a place called the guf. And the Mashiach ben David cannot come until finally every one of the souls which is in the guf, this place, will eventually go down to the planet Earth and become a body and a soul together and become a person. He will become an Adam. So until every soul that's in the place called guf comes down to the earth and becomes a person, the Mashiach cannot come. That's what it says. So it seems to be that there's a certain reason that God created people. There's a certain reason that why God created the exact number of people that he created. What is that reason? What is going on here? We do not understand the concept of multiplicity for human beings. Why are there so many people created throughout history? So the answer to that is a shocking conclusion. Every person who is created is not really a person. Every person symbolizes something else. What? Well, it's obviously, since you need all these people, and you need all of them to do mitzvahs, the same mitzvahs, the Tayyag mitzvahs of the Torah, the 630 mitzvahs of Torah, every Jew has to do that to whatever is applicable. Why? That means that the construction of Olam Haba requires every Jew to exist. That's right. The reason why every Jew must be created, the certain number that God ordained, has to come down to the earth and do the mitzvahs, is because the work that each Jew has to do is completely necessary for the construction of Olam Haba. But not only that, there is something else that occurs. Not only is every Jew required to do the specific task that he has to do to construct Olam Haba, but every task the Jew does cannot be done by another Jew. What? In other words, there's no such thing as the repetition of tasks when it comes to Olam Haba. Olam Haba needs a certain number of different tasks, and each task, each work that a person has to do is unique to that person. So therefore, if God had to make mankind to be 1 million people, let's say, if that means that 1 million people have to be born because there were 1 million different types of jobs. That's right. There was no 20 people doing one job or 1,000 people doing one job. There was no such thing as really a category of people doing a specific job. No. A job had to be done by each individual. Each individual had his own task, which was involved in the creation of the structure called Olam Haba. So therefore, mankind is not simply an organism where they're all working together. In a certain sense, mankind is an organism that is composed of each individual Jew. Every Jew is a part of an organism. It's not even like the human body. The human body is an organism which has different organs that work together to keep the person alive. But there are certain cells composed in each organism, in each organ. For example, the heart. The heart has cells. It has many cells. And there are many cells that work together to do the same job. But that's not the truth of Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael is not working together to do the same job. Right? It's a superorganism. A regular normative organism is that there are groups of people or groups of cells or whatever entities they are that work together to do different types of jobs. So the heart has what's called cardiac cells. The stomach has stomach cells. The lungs have lung cells. So there are large groupings of cells that work together to do different types of jobs. But these are done in groups. But Klal Yisrael is different because Klal Yisrael is not done in groups. Klal Yisrael does the job the work of the Jewish people in building Olam Haba is done by individuals. There are no groups in the construction of Olam Haba. And that's what Chazal means. When Chazal says, that every soul must come down, but souls do not come down as groups. Souls come down as individuals. And what it says is that the Mashiach cannot come until every individual who is destined to come down by himself comes down. Why? Because that individual has to do an individual unique job which pertains only to him. So therefore we see an amazing concept of what Chazal is saying. No Jew can do the job of another Jew. That's right. If a Jew does not do his job, the job doesn't get done. The totality of the job does not get done. And this is absolutely shocking. The level of being an organism for Klal Yisrael is not a normative organ, because Klal Yisrael does not function in terms of groups. It functions in terms of individuals. Olam Haba must be constructed by individuals, where each individual has his own task and can do things which no other person can do. And therefore, that's why Olam Haba, to be constructed through the mitzvahs, has to be performed by a certain number of people, each one doing his job individually. Wow. How many people know that? How many people know that the job, the task, the avodah of each Jew is an individual avodah that cannot be done by another Jew? In other words, another Jew maybe can help a Jew do his task, but he cannot do it. So a person called Reuven does one job, and a person called Yehuda does another. Yehuda and Reuven do not do the same job. They cannot do the same job. It requires both Yehuda and Reuven to do the two separate jobs. So that means that the organismic structure of Klal Yisrael is based on the integrity of the building of Olam Haba. Each person must do his own separate job alone. Maybe he can use some help, but fundamentally he alone can do that. Which means that Klal Yisrael is not an organism. It's not a normative organism. It is a superorganism composed of individuals, not of categories, not of groups. Wow. I wonder how many people know this. That means that the guy you're sitting next to in shul is completely different than you. He has a completely different job, and it rests up to him to do the job. In other words, if he doesn't do his job, all of Klal Yisrael is affected. Because if that one component is missing in Olam Haba, there is no Olam Haba. So therefore we see an amazing concept that each Jew who has to do his specific job endangers not only himself, he endangers oil of Olam Haba, which means he endangers Klal Yisrael. He endangers every other Jew. And this is an incredible fact. When we make a bar mitzvah, and we make a certain bar mitzvah for a certain person who becomes bar mitzvah, this person who's becoming bar mitzvah is not simply we're saying, well, you're under the category of chuppah, ma'asim tovim, mitzvahs. No. You are actually... could all the people please silence their machines? Each Jew is required to build Olam Haba, and if they don't do their job, Olam Haba is not built. That means that every Jew endangers every other Jew. So therefore we see free will does affect other people. You see it? What? Each person is necessary. In free will, is each person, when a person becomes bar mitzvah, you are already inviting a new person to do a new task that cannot be done by anyone else. It's not that a person becomes a Jew. In a certain sense, a Jew is an individual affair. No Jew is like any other Jew. Every person in the shul daven is unique, is different, is separate, is an individual, completely an unrepetitive type of person. No person in your shul is like any other person. Each person has his own job, and this is shocking. That Olam Haba should be based on the avodah of individuals. So this is not even like a building which requires electricians, plumbers, carpenters, groups of people to do certain types of skills. Klal Yisrael is not divided by skills. That's right. It's not a skill that a Jew has to do when he does the avodah of doing the mitzvahs. It's not a skill. It's the person himself. The consciousness of that person himself is absolutely necessary for the construction of Olam Haba. So Olam Haba, the construction of Olam Haba, is not dependent on skills. Because skills can be taught to many people. You can get categories of people who have professional skills. Skills are dependent on individuals, on the individual core consciousness of each individual is that which constructs Olam Haba. It's a din in the yochid. It's not a din in the rabbim. It depends on the individual, which means it depends on the consciousness, the awareness, the self-awareness of each individual. That is fundamentally what's necessary to build Olam Haba, not the skill of building Olam Haba. So we see a tremendous concept over here. It's unique. So therefore we see that if a Jew does not do his job, right? If he does not do a job, if he does not do the mitzvahs that is required of him, he jeopardizes the construction of Olam Haba. He jeopardizes all of Klal Yisrael. So now we understand the concept of a mitzvah. When it says Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh, every Jew is a collateral for every other Jew. Why? There are many times I see Jews and I don't even know they're Jewish. I cannot identify them. Yet the Torah says that I am an Orev. I have to be collateral for that Jew. Why? Why do I have to be collateral for someone I don't know? Because fundamentally the Torah is saying, because without that other Jew, you have no Olam Haba. That's it. Without each and every Jew being born and coming down to the world to do his avodah, you have no Olam Haba. That's why you are an Orev. So now we understand. We understand why you have to do the mitzvahs. And we understand why the mitzvahs are not suggestions. Because if it was simply based on skills and the categories of people who do these skills, God would say, you have to be nice to each other. You have to be tranquil. You have to respect each person because the skill of each person is necessary to build a building. But that's not what God says. God says to a Jew, you must, as a commandment, respect another Jew. You have no option. The Torah says what? You should not verbally abuse another Jew. Why not? Why do I have to respect another Jew? We can both do our jobs and we hate each other. If one carpenter hates another carpenter, but they're both involved in the construction of a building, the building can still be constructed because the construction job is based on skills, and skills can be taught to one person or many people. But the concept of a person is the concept of an individual, the concept of a core, the concept that only he knows himself. There's only one himself. There's only one itself. There's only one self to each person. Each person has a different sense. Reuben only knows that Reuben exists. And how does he know it? By his core. Yehuda knows that Yehuda exists. And he knows that by his core. The core of each person is absolutely different. Just like each person has an individuality which is completely his own and he does not share the individuality of himself. He can share the fact that he has a body. He can share that he has arms and legs and a body. But he cannot share the inner ego. The inner ego is simply, it's not the ego of simply of a man. It's the ego of Reuven, or it's the ego of Yehuda. And that ego is unlike the ego of every other person who was ever created. Why? Why does God do this? Why does each person is different? A person is qualitatively different. not quantitatively different. It's not that each person has a certain personality or a certain ego. No, each person has his own ego with its own qualities, its own level of free will, and the own avoda or the own task that he has to do. Which means that it's not based on skills, it's based on the concept of a person. And a person is nothing more than a self who's conscious of himself through himself. The himself of every person is different than the himself of every other person. So the construction of Olam Haba is unique. It's a superorganism of unique people where each one's ego, in sense of self and sense of itself, is different than any other person who was ever created. Wow. If this is true, that's why God gives his commandment. He says to you, you don't have an option. You don't have an option. There's no option to disrespect a person. There's no option to speak Lashon Hara. You know, there's no option to speak Chilis. There's no option to hate people. The mitzvah is Gemilas Chasodim is a mitzvah. It's not a suggestion. You must take care of another Jew because you must take care of Olam Haba. It's synonymous with Olam Haba itself. If you don't take care of another Jew, you are destroying your own Olam Haba and all of Olam Haba for all Jews together since the beginning of time. That is the nature of individuality. Each individual is his own construction job. And without him, the job cannot be duplicated in a certain sense by another. That's why all the midos, all the attributes, all the behaviors that are between one person and another are considered commandments. Why? Because just like an electrical circuit, which has in it capacitors, resistors, and inductors, every electrical circuit has in it different types of electrical equipment. Every circuit has in it it has certain conductors. There are certain which conduct the current. There are certain resistors which prevent the current from going. There are certain capacitors which store the current. So each electrical circuit is unique in terms of what it has. Now, if two things are the same instrument, it does have the same design. But you cannot give a common design to a person. Why? Because a person has an entity with himself called a self. Every person knows he's aware of himself by himself. And that himself is the core of a person and is different for every human being, every person that was ever created. There's no such thing as a group of people. That's right. There is no such thing. The person, by definition, is an individual. It's a species of one person. So, therefore, human beings are not categories of skills. They are not categories of people who live in neighborhoods. They are not categories of a nation, citizens. No, every person is his own being, his own entity that is completely unlike the being of every other entity. The only thing that exists among people is his own individuality, which differentiates him in a total way from the individuality of every other person. So now we see why God gave the mitzvahs ben adam mechaveru as mitzvahs, because he's not giving you an option. Because that option is to destroy Olam Haba. That option is to destroy Klal Yisrael. This is a completely different idea. Olam Haba is based on consciousness, the consciousness of each individual. It's the construction of consciousness from all individuals by themselves, each one by himself. So that if you are missing one individual, you are missing Olam Haba itself. In other words, if you're missing one carpenter in a construction job, so then the other carpenters will take over the job and they can all do the exact same job that he could do. But if you're talking about Olam Haba, the construction of Olam Haba, through its integrity, its integration, is composed of conscious minds. And each conscious mind is separate and differentiated from every other conscious mind. So it's an organism of individuals, not an organism of collections. Therefore, that's called a superorganism, and that entails the requirement of mitzvahs. You must do the mitzvahs, or else you jeopardize everyone. Now, how many people know this? How many people really realize this? I don't know if any people realize this. And therefore, the greatest avla, the greatest fault of Klal Yisrael, that Klal Yisrael has never taught us to each other. That's right. Klal Yisrael teaches people Gemara, Talmud, Mishnah, so on and so forth. It teaches all these things, Mishnah, Gemara, Tanakh, yes, but nowhere in Tanakh do you find this concept so explicitly stated that Klal Yisrael is a superorganism. So that's why people speak Lashon Hara and Mechilas. People hate each other. People abuse each other because nobody understands that you are abusing someone, not another person, not someone as a similar species. The word species is a collective term which applies to all of us. But mankind is not a species. That's right. Mankind is not a species like plants, roses, or plants, or insects, ants. Ants are a species. Lions are a species. Cape buffaloes are a species. But human beings are not a species. Each individual is his own entity. Each individual is his own species. Unlike any other species. That's right. The term species applies to each individual separately. How many people know that? And is this ever taught to Klal Yisrael? So the very fact that God gave the mitzvahs to Bein Adam Mechaveru is an indication of how God sees each Jew, how he's connected to each other. As far as God is concerned, if there are 20 million Jews, there are 20 million different species. Each person is a species. And this is a very profound concept which has never really been accentuated and focused in Klal Yisrael. So therefore, Klal Yisrael continues to be transgressed the mitzvahs of Bein Adam Chaveroi continuously, and they can't stop it because Klal Yisrael sees itself as a species, because they see we are all people who are chayav tayag mitzvahs. We are all obligated to 630 commandments, but we are a species that are obligated to 630 commandments. And the answer is, I tell you, Klal Yisrael is not a species who has to do the 630 commandment. But who is it? Reuven is his own species. Yehuda is his own species. Yisachar is his own species. Each Jew is the species that does similar things, but in certain ways, he does something in a different way. There's a completely differential variable that applies to each and every Jew, which does not apply to any other Jew and cannot be done by any other Jew. So the biological way to see what a human being is absolutely false. Is absolutely false. We all have the goyish view of what Jews are. Now, why is it important to know this? Because then we will have a motive to us to treat another Jew with respect. Because we will be treating another critical worker. Every Jew is critical to the construction of Olam Haba. How can you not respect that? How can you not respect that? And that's why there is no Hanukkah. There is no Festival of Lights. There's no Oris. There's no Nun. There's nothing without the appreciation of what? Thou not stand by the blood of another Jew. Why? Because he is different than you. He is his own species. To hurt another Jew, to rob from another Jew, to kill another Jew, is to wipe out a species. It's not to wipe out. You're not wiping out an individual in a species. You are wiping out a species itself. So that's why these are commandments. That's why these are necessary. And if you don't do this, you not only jeopardize the hashgacha, the destiny of Klal Yisrael, you jeopardize all of Olam Haba, because the integration of all of Olam Haba in itself requires the integration of each species person. A person is nothing more than a species himself. So therefore he should be called Ruvain species, Yehuda species, Yisachar species, Don species. Each person has to have an appellation after his name. His second name should be species, because he himself is a unique, individual, differentiated species, unlike any other person in existence. And that's what determines why Gavanisha made people. Why did he make people? He didn't make people. He made different species to do specifically unique jobs. Each person has to do the unique job which is involved in the construction of Olam Haba. So the Gavanisha only made the workers who were required. And every Jew who was ever born is required. It's not optional. And this is the single most powerful idea, perhaps in Kol Torah Kula. Because what is God telling you? What God is saying to you, just like I am absolutely one, you say Hashem Echad, right? Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. God is one. And there is no other. There cannot be another. God is telling you the same thing about the Zulasoi. Each individual is absolutely one. Each Zulasoi is one. Each Zulasoi is his own species with his own task that relates to something that only he can do. So just like I am one, he is one. And the human being will never become collective. You will never see a bunch of people together and say, you are part of one species. No, each person in the group is a species in himself. I am completely transforming the concept of what a person is and what Olam Haba is. Olam Haba is composed of 20 million species. That's right, not one species called Jews, 20 million species. Each one has to do his own unique job. And I hope you understand this. Because if you do understand this, this should affect your ability in the way you treat other Jews. And the necessity for being kind to other Jews, not hurting another Jew. Because you are dealing with a new species as you deal with each individual. In a certain way, which is hard to understand, when you are standing in front of another Jew, you have to shake. You have to tzita, because you are standing in front of a new species called Ruvain, a new species called Yehuda, a new species called Yisachar. And therefore you, in a certain sense, have to respect that person with such solemnity, with such gravity. You literally can shake. It's like standing in front of a king. A king is only one person. Only one king rules the nation. So when you see a king or a president, how do you stand? You stand with ultimate respect. So with each person, you stand with ultimate respect, because each person is a king. You are making a tremendous mistake when you think that each person is part of a group. When you treat him like that and therefore you abuse him, you are making a disastrous mistake. Each person is a melech. Each person is a king. Each person has a unique power that nobody else in existence has. That's why all of Klal Yisrael is collateral for each other. We are a nation of kings. We are a nation of queens. Each one is unique, totally. And that's the way we should see each other. That's the way we should respect each other. That's the way we should behave to each other. And until we do that, until we see what another Jew is, we will not be Zocher to Hanukkah. We will not be Zocher to the 50th gate. Because what do you think the 50th gate is telling you? The 50th gate is telling you what? that each person is a king. That's why the Bnei Hashem gave all the commandments on Bein Adam Chaveroi. He did not give you these mitzvahs as a category of mitzvahs. These commandments apply to kings. And that's a very strange concept. Usually a behavioral commandment applies to what? Individuals. In other words, a nation has rules. But these rules and laws apply to everyone equally. No. According to the Torah, Olam Haba does not apply to everyone equally. Everyone applies to a king, because each person is a king in the construction of Olam Haba. So could you imagine that you belong to a nation of kings, of unique people? That is absolutely astounding. And when that happens, then you will get your Mashiach. Then you will get your Olam Haba. But you have to know what you're doing. You have to know how to construct it. Now the question is, we have to ask a second question. What happens if that person doesn't do his mitzvahs? Right? Does that mean that there cannot be an Olam Haba? So obviously we see something else about the organism called a Jew. The organism called a Jew is composed of the individual as each species. But what happens if that Jew is fried? What happens if that Jew is not from? What happens if that Jew doesn't believe in God, or is an atheist, or doesn't do one of the mitzvahs, or doesn't respect, or is evil to another Jew? What about him? Does that mean that Olam Haba cannot be constructed because he does not create Olam Haba? No. Why? Because because all the Jewish people are in another sense an organism. Yes. Because I didn't say they weren't an organism. I didn't say that a Jew is an organism by himself. I said that what a Jew is, he's a superorganism. Well, what is a superorganism? A superorganism, the word super refers to the fact that he's a king. This is an organism of kings. This is not an organism of people, but he is still an organism. The word super applies to the fact that he's a king. That's why it's super, but he's still an organism. And in an organism, there's a certain what's called organismic flexibility. Yes. And where do you see this? You see this actually in the human body. You see this in the brain. Because when a person, for example, has a stroke, when suddenly there's a clot in the brain when the person has a stroke, so a certain area of the brain dies. It cannot function. So let's say the person in a certain sense becomes paralyzed. Because the cells in his motor coordination, in the motor part of the brain, the cerebellum or the cerebrum or the zone is damaged. So what happens if a part of the brain is damaged? What does the person do? Well, let's say he can't walk. But what happens? There's such a thing as physical therapy. And what is physical therapy? It's based on the principle of the flexibility of an organism, because the brain is an organism in total. So therefore, it is possible to train other parts of the brain to take over this function. That's right. So this, in a certain sense, compromises uniqueness of a king. It does. Because if that king does not do his job, even though he's the only one who fundamentally is connected to that job, is attached to that job, but that job can still be taken over by someone else. Because it has to. The organism of Klal Yisrael has to be able to take care of people who don't do their jobs. So even though the Bnei Hashem commanded you to do their job, to indicate to them their relationship, they don't have to do that, or they won't do that. So what does God do? He makes the Jewish people into not only kings, species, each one is a species, but he makes it into a species in a certain sense which is flexible. That means that other people can do his job, and that's called substitution. Just like the brain can take different parts of itself and assign to those parts of the brain that are working and that are healthy to do the job that was left undone by the part of the brain that suffered a stroke. That's right. So therefore, you can do physical therapy. You can retrain the person in certain activities. Now, I don't know exactly which of those activities are. I'm not familiar with that. I'm not a neurologist. But the study of neurology is also the study which parts of the brain can actually substitute when a certain part of the brain becomes dysfunctional. That's right. So I would imagine that a neurologist or a neuropsychologist and so on would have to know. So in other words, the brain is not only a species where each cell is a species, but the brain is also an organism because it has to have flexibility in case one person does not do what he has to do. So in that regard, you have three different possibilities. In the concept of organismic flexibility, where the brain can suddenly function like an organism, where it can actually take over the role of someone else who doesn't do his role. It's an organism. And there are three possibilities. The first possibility is that even though a person doesn't do his job, that doesn't mean that he'll be annihilated. Why? Because it's the organismic nature, and this is really incredible. Who is the Mashiach and what does he do? The Mashiach is like the picture of Dorian Gray. He takes on the visage, the sight of the sins of Klal Yisrael. So he's called the Sovlich Haloyim, somebody who suffers diseases or inabilities or diseases and so on and so forth for the rest of Klal Yisrael. So when Klal Yisrael does sins, many people do sins, somebody has to bear the suffering which those sins bring, because Klal Yisrael cannot bear it alone. They would be destroyed. So this one individual and other individuals who are part of his performance are called, he's called the Mashiach, and these are called messianic accomplices. These people are Sovlich Haloyim. So for the sins that Klal Yisrael does, they have the damage to their souls, but you cannot see the damage on their body. So they don't look like they sinned at all. You can take a total Russia who sins against people and against God all the time, but the sins that he has cannot be visible on the surface on his body. You cannot tell that he's a Russia, only if you know him, because the sins do not show itself on his body. Where do they show itself? On his soul. But because they don't show itself on his body, you cannot see it. And therefore, the Mashiach can bear that suffering. He sees that suffering in himself. He sees that. And in a certain way, it does slightly appear on him. So that's why he's called a Sovlich Haloyim. So therefore, for those souls that do not do their job, the Mashiach and the people who are assigned to do his task, who are called Sovlich Haloyim, take on the role of encountering that suffering which the person himself should have had. And by taking on that suffering, he saves the person. And the person is given another chance, and another chance, and another chance. Then the person can be redeemed through Gilgulim, through reincarnations. Through reincarnations, a person can make up for the sins that he did. But in order to have him survive, the Mashiach has to take on this person's visage and perhaps to some extent his suffering. And that's called Sovlich Haloyim. And how could the Mashiach do that? How can one person suffer for another? Well, the answer is because the person is not a single person. He's a group person. He's an organism. And that's the difference between the Jewish king and the Jewish part of an organism. He is both. He is a king in the sense that he is his own species with his own unique job. But in a certain level, he's also an organism, because he can do something for another Jew that the other Jew will not do for himself. So therefore, he can save Olam Haba. So the Jewish people together are an organism, but they are an organism of kings. That's the definition of the Jewish people. They are an organism because they can replace each other in a certain way, and they are also kings because each one is his own species. So therefore, the Sovlich Haloyim can save Klal Yisrael. Now, there's also another possibility. When another soul comes along to another soul, and he helps that soul do his job. So even though the soul cannot do the job, he's failing in terms of his unique task, but another soul can invade the person. That's called an ibur, where the other person, one soul, goes into the body which is inhabited by another soul, that's called an ibor. And therefore he can assist that Jew in doing the specific mitzvahs that he is specifically attached to. So the soul called an ibor then becomes a partner to another soul. So because he helps the soul of a Jew, of a specific Jew, to do certain mitzvahs that he cannot do or will not do, he becomes to a certain extent a partner in the olam haba of the other Jew. And how can he do that? Because he's an organism. An organism, the concept of an organism, allows the interaction between Jews that one Jew can help another Jew, or one Jew can suffer for another Jew. And this can only exist because the Jewish people are, besides the fact that they are kings and a species unto themselves, they are also an organism. And finally, if the person doesn't do the job, another soul can completely take over this new job. And what's the classic example of this? There's one classic example where one soul took over the old function of humanity. That's right. There was once a story of a certain specific person who took over the chelik of everyone in Olam Haba. Almost. Not quite, but almost. And who was that? That was our forefather, that was our patriarch forefather, Avraham Avinu. Because the whole world would worship idols and therefore refused to do their job as a king. So therefore Avraham Avinu, who's the super king, did that job, who worshipped God, who believed in God in terms of Zamunah. So therefore what happened was God therefore suddenly made him the substitute who took over everyone's chelik, but not totally. Temporarily and on a certain level, Avraham Avinu took over the royalty of every individual in the world who gave up his fundamental job in terms of uniqueness. But he did not take over their job totally, because God still wanted to renew their job by Matan Torah. And he went around to all the nations of the world and he said, do you want to accept the Taryag mitzvahs, the 630 mitzvahs, and therefore create Olam Haba, construct Olam Haba? And they all said to God, no, we're not interested. So at that point, God took away the unique task that was given to each one as a former king and gave the whole thing to the Jewish people. So therefore, only the Jewish people can construct Olam Haba. Anyone who is not Jewish does not have the soul that's capable of that construction. They can reside in Olam Haba if they keep the 7 mitzvahs of Noach. They can rent a room in Olam Haba, but they cannot be a landlord. They cannot construct because they refuse to take that. So Avraham Avinu took over the royal role of every king on earth, every person on earth, because they refused to do their unique job. But he only took that over temporarily. But that was finalized by Matan Torah when they all refused to accept the Taryag mitzvahs. So therefore we see 3 possibilities. That there are Sovei that people who suffer, there are Jews who suffer, so that other Jews will not show and will not be punished as a consequence of their sin in truth. And then there's a second option where a soul can enter a person's body and work with it to do his unique job, and therefore become a partner in a certain sense in Olam Haba. And the third thing is where the person gives up his job completely and loses that uniqueness. And then because he's an organism, because he's part of the Jewish people as a king - species - organism, he can actually take over the full job itself, just like the brain. The brain, one section of it, can take over the complete function of another part, so the person can learn to walk again through different cells of the brain. And that's called organismic flexibility. So we have 3 possibilities where if a Jew does not do his job, where he can lose his chelik in Olam Haba. Yes, he basically would be very difficult for him to lose his chelik, but he still may be able to do it. The Ramchal says that a Jew can lose his chelik in Olam Haba. But fundamentally, this is what it is. So in that case, the principle of organismic flexibility suddenly becomes in play. And different people can help him or take care of him or so on and so forth, or actually replace him. So therefore we see fundamentally that a Jew is two things. He is a king. He has a unique job that nobody else can do. He therefore is his own species. He does not share the term species with any other person. And God created exactly the number of people who would become their own species, individual species. Not one more and one less. God created the exact number of kings who were necessary to create Olam Haba. And each one is a king, unique. A king is not a species. The nation is a species, not a king. A king is unique, differentiated, alone, individual. And every Jew is an individual, unless he refuses to do his job. In that case, there's a certain concept called an organism, where because of his relationship to other kings, there are other kings who can help him out, or instead do the job for him. So therefore, a Jew is a combination of two concepts. He is both an individual species, and he is both an organism. As a species, he has his own unique job, and as an organism, he can be helped by other people who are their own king species. So that's what Klal Yisrael, and that's why God gave mitzvahs to Klal Yisrael. Beinodim Mechaveiro is not a category of suggestions. It's not an Eitzah Tova. It is a mitzvah. It's a commandment, because God says you have to do your job. Because if you don't do your job, theoretically, lechatchila, Olam Haba will be annihilated. So therefore, your free will jeopardizes. It does not jeopardize God. It does not affect God in any sense, but it can affect other Jews. So therefore, the concept of the Jewish people as an organism suddenly becomes extant. Suddenly, that takes a role. And as an organism, other Jews can come in and help the Jew out who refused to do his job. So what I'm telling you is a new concept, a fundamental concept. And why am I telling you this concept on Hanukkah? Because you're not going to have a Hanukkah if the Jews don't realize who they are and what they are. There will not be a Hanukkah. So the Nun, which is characterized the Yemot Mashiach, does not descend to Klal Yisrael until Klal Yisrael gets it. So until Jewish education as we know it begins to focus on what a Jew is, that a Jew is not simply a nice guy who has to be kind and respecting to another Jew. That's not God says. God does not say that. He does not suggest that one Jew respects another Jew. He commands it. He demands it and commands it. Because each Jew determines the destiny of all of Klal Yisrael. And that's the shir.
Shimon, thank you. Just one clarity. When you say the Jew is a king, do you mean to say besides that they're part of an organismic existence, they have somewhat of an individual self-awareness? That's why you're calling them a king? Is that what you mean by a king? It's a component of self. Yeah, okay, so I wanted to make sure. That's what I thought.
The component of self-awareness, which means that let me repeat it. Every person knows himself. How? By himself. That word, by himself, shows you that he is an individual, unlike any individual. In other words, you know yourself, right? The way you know yourself is not duplicated or repeated by any single man that was ever created in human history. There is only one person called Tres. There will only be one person called Tres, Shlomo Tres, and that's it. And I just mentioned your name, not to publicize who you are, but to show you who you are. You are a king. You are not a subject who is in a kingdom. You are not part of a kingdom. You are not part of a species. You are the species. And therefore, everyone is a king. But every person is also an organism that he can substitute for another. So therefore, the definition of a person, the Zulosai, is a superorganism. He is super because he is his own species, and he's an organism which has flexibility where one person can somewhat take over for another person.
That would also explain, Shimon, I don't know if I'm right, but that would explain the concept of madregas and Olam Haba.
No, we're not talking about madregas.
I know, I'm just saying you can't explain that.
So now, well, I'm redefining madrega. Madrega is not simply a level of Olam Haba. We always think of Olam Haba as levels, right? There's the highest level, there's a medium level, there's the lowest level. But the truth of the matter is, Olam Haba is not constructed by levels. It's not. It's constructed by species. Each species is its own makom. Every Jew has a specific makom, and that makom has nothing to do with level. So there are two fundamental characteristics to Olam Haba. It has levels and it has individual makom. Each makom is an individual construction by an individual species composed of one person. But that also has a level. It corresponds to a level 2. But as much as there's the concept of level, there's the concept of makom. Each makom is different than every other makom in Olam Haba. And not only that, Olam Haba as a place, as a condition of consciousness, requires each makom to be total. And someday we will understand exactly what that means. Makom is a qualitative principle. Level, madrega, is a quantitative precision. So the Olam Haba has two qualities. It has a quality, it has two traits, a quality and a quantity. The quantity is its madrega, the quality is the specific makom that was created specifically for the one person who is the king of that makom, and nothing else fits into that. Now, how do I know there's another raya? Now that you mention it, there's another raya that a person is a king. Because it says, what is Olam Haba? Chazal say, Tzadikim Yoshem, Tzadikim are sitting. They're sitting in Olam Haba enjoying it, right? But it describes the Tzadikim. It says, what are they? What are Tzadikim in Olam Haba? It says, V'itloseim b'rosheiim, and their crowns are on their heads. And they benefit from the Shina. What does that mean, their crowns are on their head? What is the Gemara referring to when it's talking about people? It's saying they have crowns. Well, wait a minute, the only one who was a crown is a king, right? Nobody was a crown. The king is unique. What makes him unique is the Torah. And that's the sphere of Kessin. Every Jew has his own crown, which means that every Jew is his own king, and a king is not part of a species. In royalty, the king is the ruler of the species. He is not part of the species. He's outside of the species. He has a power which no one else shares. And the Gemara is telling us every Jew is his own power, is his own species. No one shares it. No one shares the self-awareness of every single individual. And that makes each person a king, as the member says. Tzadikim Yoshem, Tzadikim are sitting, and their crowns are on their head. Why? Who has a crown? A king. A self-contained individual species. Olam Haba is about kings. It is about the residence of kings. Olam Haba is not about the residence of what? Of a species. Residence of just people. It's a residence of Malachim. And the day we understand that, and the day we understand what our relationship is with other Jews, is the day that Hanukkah will no longer be a holiday. Hanukkah will be the time that the 50th gate will descend. And then we will all be kings. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you for listening.
I have one question. I was curious, before Avraham, in times of Tohu, what were people? Were they kings also like this?
Yes, of course. A king is created at birth. When a child is born, that child is automatically a royal prince. He is destined to be a king. That's like the royal prince. Every king, his children have the potential to be the king in a certain order. But the first child the first male or female child, basically male, that's created, even female, is called the royal prince, the prince designate. And he's actually a king. He's just a king. He's a king in waiting. The only reason why he's not a king at birth is because he doesn't have the qualities of intelligence. He doesn't have the mind to function, to understand reality, and that he's an individual. But he is the potential king. He is the next king. So therefore, every Jew who's born automatically is the prince that's destined to be a king. And as soon as he's a bar mitzvah, you know what a bar mitzvah is? It's the coronation. You don't even understand what a bar mitzvah is. A bar mitzvah is not a celebration. It's not a celebration of someone also having to do 613 commandments. No. A bar mitzvah is a celebration. It's the coronation. A bar mitzvah is a coronation. And for a girl at 12, it's a coronation. The girl is the queen and the boy is the king. We do not even understand what a bar mitzvah is. A bar mitzvah is not a celebration. It's not a yontif. It's not a simcha. It's a coronation itself. He enters the world of mitzvahs and he becomes the king of his chelik in Olam Haba. So I am completely renewing, I'm completely transforming concepts that you have never thought of and you have never realized. Judaism is not a religion of people. It's not a mass public religion. It's a religion of kings. Because that's what Olam Haba is. Olam Haba is a castle. Each castle houses a king. If you understand that and you change your behavior to accommodate that understanding, you have reached the madrega where eventually, quickly, you will be zeicher to a nun. Okay.
Thank you, Shimon.
Shimon, one point. You once told me that if Asa would have done his tikkun, then the Geula would have came much earlier, and we wouldn't need all the Yisurim of Klal Yisrael, yes. Something along those lines.
Right, the function of Asa was similar. Asa's function was to bring the Tahara. Yaakov's function was to bring the Kedusha, similar to the Mashiach. You know, Asa was similar to the Mashiach ben Yosef. He was supposed to bring the purification. He was supposed to purify the world from the sins of Adam Rishon down. And Yaakov was supposed to elevate physicality to spirituality and bring Olam Haba. Both of them were somewhat similar to the two Mashiachim, Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben David. But Asa failed.
And then when Asa failed, what happened?
So when Asa failed, Yaakov said to the Banasham, okay, Asa failed. He gave up the Bechor. He gave up the supreme category of Mashiach ben Yosef. Now there is no one to do this. So you know what Yaakov said? I will do it. There's a Rashi that says, where Yaakov actually said to God, so then I will do it. Yaakov, the twin brother of Esau, took over the role of Yosef. And he continued that role in Yosef HaTzadik. What role was that? That was a role he was not supposed to have. He only sat and he was the tachlis of Yaakov was to be a Yoshev Olam, to sit in his tent and learn Torah, to Maba Kedusha, bring Kedusha to the world, holiness. Asa was supposed to one who was supposed to eliminate contamination from the world, from the sin of Adam Rishon and the sin of all of mankind. But Asa gave that task up. He gave up his unique kingship. He gave it up. So Yaakov Avinu said, I will take it. I will take both tasks, the task of Kedusha and the task of Tahara. You know? And that's what Yaakov actually said. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu said to Esav. Moshe Rabbeinu in the desert wanted to cross the land of Esav, and Esav did not want to give them permission. So Moshe Rabbeinu said, but wait a minute, but we took over your task. Your forefather Esav lost it. He gave it up. And Yaakov Avinu, his twin brother, agreed to accept the task. You have to let us through your territory. Why? Because you owe us. So we see another example of one Jew who's a king taking over the role of another Jew who's a king, but a different type of king.
Shimon, this last point that you said about Yaakov and Esav, the Ramchal says this openly in, I believe it's Parashas Vayishlach Yitzchak, right? By Lovin Garti.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to bring out is even though Yaakov took over Esav's task, he still couldn't do it as powerfully as Esav would have done it himself. Mamish, what you're saying.
Well, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying anything. I'm not comparing the substitute from the principle. I don't know. I mean, I'm not really saying. I don't really know if the task is taken over by another person. Is he given the full task? Does he take it over? Or does he need more than just himself? And possibly you're correct. Because the task of Mashiach ben Yosef was taken over not only by Yaakov, but it was also taken over by Yosef. Because it says that Yaakov and Esav, it says Yaakov is a fire and the Yosef is the flame of the fire. There's a pasuk that says that. So it seems to be that Yaakov and Yosef together comprised the task that was originally solely given to the brother called Esav. So I'm not comparing exactly the distribution of that power. That will have to be done for another share. But know that it can be substituted from because of the principle, because of the principle of what quality? That the Jewish people are not only kings, but they are also an organism. They are a superorganism. Super implies king. They are alone in their task. Each one is alone in their task. An organism applies to the concept of flexibility, where they are still a group, and in certain cases they can then substitute from one another in different combinations and permutations. So there's an interaction that's possible because of their quality as an organism. But at the same time, there's also a uniqueness that applies to each one separately from the other. Because what? Olam Haba is a construction of what? Of consciousness. Olam Haba is a construction. It's a total consciousness of the Jewish people. And each one is a king in his manifestation of consciousness. So Olam Haba is not a construction job like a building, where you have classes of individuals who have the same skill. No. The skill of Olam Haba is the person. The person is the skill, and the only one who represents the skill. But since he's also an organism, that can be substituted. But the principle that we're seeing is what is the integration, the integrity of Olam Haba. Olam Haba is not composed like a building of construction through skills. It's a construction of self-awareness, consciousness, the totality of consciousness that belongs to the Zulosoi. The Zulosoi not only represents an individual consciousness, but in its totality, and this is what's called the Tikkun HaKloli. The Tikkun HaKloli means that the Tikkun has to be done not only to each Jew as a king, but it has to be done to all of them together as a group. But it's a group, it's not a species, it's a group of kings. And what is that? That's the totality of consciousness. And what determines the totality of self-awareness, the totality of consciousness, what's called the Maxi Zulosoi. The Zulosoi as he is himself, who Adam Rishon was. The only Zulosoi who actually reflected the totality of Olam Haba and the totality of the consciousness of the Olam Haba was Adam Rishon before the sin. He was the combination of every human being that was ever born since that time. And that was a total consciousness, which was removed from him from the Chet and never duplicated it again. But it does exist in some level where in a certain sense that's where we are an organism. That's why mankind is an organism. It must be an organism. It's not only an organism, it's a superorganism. An organism of kings.
Interesting.
How do we understand Goyim in this king mashal?
That's another concept. I'll talk about that at another time.
Reb Shimon, I sent to the group a piece of Adir, how he says it. And he says it exactly the way you're saying it, Tikkun HaKloli and Tikkun HaPrati. It's a very interesting read. It's only like a page. And I sent it to the group. He goes on the post.
It's in the Adi B'Morim?
Adi B'Morim, yeah.
And he says what I'm saying?
Yeah, it seems so. You should look at it. You'll see if he does. But in a nutshell, what he says is he goes on the pasuk Eis Lasses Lashem Haferus Harisecha. There's a time when you have to obstruct the Torah, not keep the Torah. What does that go on? So he says there's two mahalchim of tikkun. There's tikkun haprati and tikkun hakloli, and normally each of them have specific borders, and nobody could do the other's job. They all have to do each individual's job, and the only one that could do it is himself. And he cannot be over his tchum to somebody else, because the only one that can do that job is the other guy. You can't supplement for him. But
right.
He says, what happens? Yeah, he says, but what happens when the Sita'acha fights the Kedusha, and it's a time of Churban, and there's a tremendous battle on Choshech, and some individuals cannot do their job? He says, then there's a time, somebody wants to show his chibet to Rabbi Shalom, like the Mashiach, it seems. When there's missing people that can't do their own tikkun, he takes the job of others. And he says, and he goes into that's called tikkun hakloli. He says, and you have to go in the cloud. Somehow there's a room.
Okay, that's okay. Thank you. That's really because this is a public share, not a private share. So
yeah, take a look at it.
Okay, thank you. The one thing I want to say
to the group.
Okay, very good. One thing I want to say about one thing. I'm giving this show on Hanukkah to tell you how to activate Hanukkah, not simply to light candles. Hanukkah is not simply lighting candles. Hanukkah is being able to benefit from the candles, which is the Nun Sharos. It's the Chodosh Al Tzion. So the one thing I want to say to anyone who listens to this share, if anyone is interested in the mazel and the hashgoch of Klal Yisrael, Jewish education must be changed. I challenge any Jew to make the attempt and change Jewish education. Because if this concept is not given over, if all they give over is different Geboras that have really nothing to do with the person's life in the end, and it never has nothing to do with this concept of why it's a mitzvah, it must be changed and incorporate in a new way what exactly a Jew is. Because if it's not, we will still be waiting for the Mashiach. And the Mashiach is about to come whether we like it or not, and we must instill this in Klal Yisrael. That means that Jewish education in all the yeshivas of the world has to incorporate this idea, and therefore must change. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you next time. Take care.